With your vehicle safely raised and supported, take off all 6 lug nuts using a 21mm socket, and then remove the wheel. If your wheel is stuck on like this one, go ahead and thread a lug nut back on, get a large rubber mallet and hit it from the backside. Always hit the tire, not the rim. There we go. And remove your wheel. To start replacing this lower control arm, I want to start by trying to remove these inner cam bolts right here. Most of the time these are completely seized, and if that's the case, I know I have to go buy new ones and I can cut these off. So I'm going to start by trying. Now the nut on here is actually one piece with the cam adjuster ring, so you're not going to be able to move that. You have to loosen up the bolt first. All right, that came loose. That's perfect. For the inner bolt here, if you can tell on camera, this is actually going to make contact with the steering rack right here, the inner tie rod. Steering rack is in the way, so it's going to have to come down. There's no way around that. And the next step, therefore, is to disconnect the steering shaft from the rack right here. You can either disconnect it down here at the rack or up there at the shaft, which is what I'm going to do. And that's because that joint right there has a spline that can only go on in one position, and so if I accidentally turn it or twist it, I can only put it back that same way, whereas down here on the rack it can go on any way. So I want to leave this just like it is, and I want to remove that. So with a 12mm socket, go ahead and remove that bolt and pull it out of the way. Now to remove the rack itself, you'll have a 19mm bolt right here that goes from the top down. I can only get to that with a ratchet from up top. You have another 19mm nut at the top of this bracket. It holds that in place, as well as a 19mm nut at the bottom of that bracket. And finally, you have a 22mm nut here with a bolt going through the frame. Take all of those off. I'm going to start with the 22mm nut. Hold the bolt head on the other side with a wrench. For now, the bolt can stay in. Take these two off. Take off this 19mm bolt here. Over here, you can use a pry bar and just pull this bracket away. Separate it from the rack. On top right here, there's a 12mm bolt holding these lines in place. Go ahead and remove that. You can, at this point, push this bolt through, pull it out the other side, and as you do that, you can pull down on the rack, and that should separate the joint up there. You're going to have to pull out at the same time so you can get this part out of the frame. All right, once that's clear, go ahead and pull down. That should separate. Perfect. And just as I thought, now you have plenty of access room for this bolt. As you can see, now I have all the room I need to get this bolt out. So with my 22mm, I'm going to attempt to break it free. there's that. At least now I don't have to cut through the bolt, I only have to cut the sleeve. So with the bolt out, I actually have pretty low hopes for this, but what I'm gonna do is try to spin this nut right here. This is the adjustment. It's most likely gonna be completely seized. Yep. All right, well, anyway, if I do the same thing to the front one, this one actually does spin, so I was able to free up the sleeve with the bolt, take off this bolt completely, and don't worry, the control arm doesn't fall down because this sleeve actually goes right through. So this bolt is still good to be reused, so is this sleeve. Everything for the rear bushing needs to be replaced. I'm gonna remove this inward cam for the front bolt, and I'll attempt to remove this inner sleeve. The less I have to cut, the better. Might have to cut it though. At this point, I'm going to disconnect the lower strut mounting bolt from the control arm, use a 19mm socket, and I'm going to hold the nut side. The nut side will have a washer and then the nut. With a punch and a hammer, remove your bolt. One last thing to disconnect before I start cutting is this sway bar link here. I'm going to put some locking pliers on the splined area of the shaft. That's going to hopefully hold the shaft in place while I blast it off with my impact. There we go. I'm going to attempt to grab this spacer plate here and unthread it, bring it out like that, and that should hopefully give me enough room to put larger locking pliers in here. There we go. Remove that. I'm just going to leave the locking pliers attached. There's no reason to take them off because I'll need them to put it on anyway, so might as well leave it. There are multiple ways to cut this. I'm going to use a reciprocating saw, and I'm going to go right in between the bushing and the frame right here and just cut straight down. All right, that's one. That's two. Take a pry bar, pry it down. That's one. And that's two. With the control arm out of the frame, the last thing to do is to disconnect this lower ball joint. Remove your cotter pin. And with a 24mm, remove this nut. But now that it's off, put it back just a few threads so that when the lower control arm breaks free, it doesn't fall down and hurt you. And now that there is pressure coming down on the control arm from the ball joint, go ahead and hammer it right here, and that should pop it free. Oh, well, I guess it only took one hit. There you go. There's your lower control arm. What's left on the frame is this little inner sleeve here, or ring, I guess, whatever you want to call it. I'm just gonna pop that out with a pry bar and a hammer. And, well, that's the outer cam. Do the same to the inner bushing. And pop this out. There you go. So it's time to install the new control arm. Before I do that, I just want to mention the fact that I cleaned up these areas here. I covered them with a little bit of grease, especially on the inside here where I have the marks from the reciprocating saw blade. I don't want to leave exposed metal, and the grease is also going to prevent it from seizing the control arm onto the frame. So put grease on the outside. I don't want those cams seizing onto the frame. I put grease on the inside so the control arm stays nice and free. On the back side too, I cleaned up all the rust chunks. And with my brand new bolts from Toyota, I put anti-seize on the shaft of the bolt as well as on the inside of the sleeve here and on the end right where the nut cam thing meets the rest of this sleeve. I don't want anything seizing in the future. I don't want this to be an issue again. So get your new control arm and position it in here. Line it up with its holes. If you need to use a hammer to bonk it up into place, you can use that. Once it's lined up with either the front or the rear, whatever lines up first, go ahead and slide this sleeve in. This is gonna hold it in place for you. Line up this rear sleeve as well, but don't forget, it comes from the back to the front, whereas the front comes from the front to the back. And put on the two caps slash nuts slash whatever else you wanna call them. And put in the bolts that go with the sleeves. The rear bolt and sleeve is actually a little bit shorter than the front, so keep that in mind. I'm gonna bottom these out. I'm not gonna tighten them yet, but I just want them bottomed out. And the reason I did this is because obviously I don't want to tighten the bushings in this position because, well, first of all, I won't be able to swing it back up, and second of all, it's going to rip the bushings if they're under tension. So you always want to torque bushings at ride level or ride height. So next, let's bring the control arm up, match it up with the ball joint stud right here. And make sure the strut falls into place also. Once you press this up into place, go ahead and start on your nut. There we go, make sure the strut is where it needs to be. I'm gonna torque the, I'm gonna tighten this ball joint first. Torque this nut to 103 foot-pounds. And if your cotter pin hole does not line up with the, and continue tightening, never loosen. A little more. Right there. Put your cotter pin through and bend it over. At this point, because I have no active load connected to this control arm, so the strut is not bolted up, I can actually freely push this control arm up, which is great for me wanting to tighten these bolts and torque them at ride level without putting any upward force on the frame. So I'm going to pull the strut a little bit out of the way, and with my pull jack, I'm going to jack up the control arm just a little bit. That's good right about there. So the torque for these bushings is 96 foot-pounds. And of course, before I torque them, I'm going to place them approximately where they were positioned before. And I remember my cams were pretty much straight up and down, so that's exactly how I'm going to position it. Of course, it's going to need a professional alignment when I'm done, but for now, if I just place them the way they were, that's going to get me close enough to drive it to my local alignment shop. And position this one too. This one was about right here. Now you can lower this and then put the strut in. Use a nice long pry bar and pry down on the control arm. Slide the strut into place. Got it. Thank you. Yeah. And on the other side of it, washer and a nut. With a 19mm socket, I'm going to snug it up. Hold the nut side with a wrench, also a 19, and then torque it to 100 foot-pounds. Next, I'm going to put on the sway bar link. To help it line up a little bit better, I'm going to jack up on the control arm just a little bit so the hole is at the correct angle for this to go into. There we go. Put on the nut, snug it up, and torque it to 51 foot-pounds. Next, you want to line up your steering rack to where it was. I have this big bolt coming through right here so I can attach it on this side, and on this side it's just resting on this stud. There we go. Reattach the nut. And on this side my bushing fell, so I'm going to put it back. And I'm going to put on my bushing cap here. Start on the nut. And the bolt up top. Snug it all up. Snug up this side as well. Torque this one right here to 122 foot-pounds. And torque these two to 96 foot-pounds. Don't forget about this center bolt right here. Don't forget about this center bolt here. And this one, well, there's no way I can torque it, but the torque would be 96 foot-pounds also. Either way, I'm just going to make it tight with a long ratchet, and that should be plenty tight. That's definitely 96 foot-pounds. One other thing is this bolt right up here that holds the lines onto the power steering rack. Don't forget about that one. Next, I need to connect this damper to this shaft, and if you're having trouble, you can just undo that lower bolt a little bit, just enough to allow the damper to drop. Once this is able to move, you should be able to easily connect the two back together. There we go. Remember, if it doesn't line up, that means your wheels have turned a little bit. Okay, so that went on. Once it goes on, you'll know because it's able to pivot up and down smoothly. Start in the top bolt. I'm going to snug up the top bolt first. And then snug up the bottom if you loosened it up. Make sure these are nice and tight. Next, get the wheel back on. Start on all 6 lug nuts, and then I'll bottom them out, torque them to 83 foot-pounds.